All right, everyone, I want to officially welcome you to today's session, Building Inclusive Classrooms, faculty training on anti-racism. It is facilitated by my lovely colleague and friend, Jennifer Ortiz. She's an English professor here at West LA College and is the CRPP faculty co-lead. Take it away, Jennifer.
Hello everyone. I'm so excited to be here. This is our third event for the CRPP grant. Here today is my co-lead Tiffany Lenoir, and she's here to just kind of give us some support. She's also going to be monitoring the chat. So please feel free to like jump in and share your thoughts and comments, and we'll be going back and forth between the presentation and your questions. I also want to acknowledge that the two events that we had earlier this year was a roundtable specifically talking to Black students that have taken online courses at West LA College. And, we got a lot of insight, and it ended up kind of forming the type of professional development we're offering. We offered this academic year at West LA. And so kind of taking the lead on the student voice, Tiffany did a training on equity-minded teaching, grading practices. She did that last semester, and so this semester we're doing our training on building inclusive classrooms, and specifically talking about how systemic racism shows up at our institutions and in our classrooms, and how we can change our kind of framework and our understanding of how systemic racism shows up, and the things that we can do, what we can do about it. So let's see, so just very quickly, does anybody know what the right hand picture is? Does anybody recognize it?
I have Sauron.
Yes, I love it. Who said that? My nerds. My nerds know Lord of the Rings. So, well, I was like trying to like figure out like, well, what are some of the correlations between what we know is, institutions of higher ed, and what are some of the tenets in terms of how higher ed is structured, and what are some of the tenets of anti-Blackness. I was trying to kind of find the parallels, and I was thinking, I was like, you know what? When we think about the ivory tower, which I'll go over, we think about it as a way, as this like kind of monumentous building that stratifies, who gets to enter, who gets to be acknowledged and validated. And usually a lot of the pictures that they showed up when I was typing in ivory tower, tower, it was this big majestic tower. And I was like, wait a minute, that's really not the impact that the ivory tower has specifically when it comes to Black students. In fact, it is a place, right, that is very hostile to Black students. And so I was like, man, let me strip this apart. It's actually the Eye of Mordor, because when you think about it, sometimes we cover, right, structural racism is covered by kind of like a veneer, or even like a pleasant facade. And then when you strip it down, you end up seeing that it's actually a very hostile environment. So I want to talk a little bit about the tenets of what an ivory tower is, right? And for some of us that have been kind of studying structural racism, we know that the ivory tower specifically is a symbol of exclusionary practices. And so I wanted to go over what some of those exclusionary practices are, and then kind of point out to you, as you can already see, how tight the parallels between the ivory tower doctrine and mentality, and how it ties very well with what are some of the tenets of anti-Blackness, and how does that show up in academia. So, the first is obviously, there is a value in hegemony. And so hegemony meaning that we center, only one voice, one experience, and that everything else is auxiliary to that experience. And so, when the ivory tower is centered on hegemony, there is a lack of diversity. There is a lack of disagreement. There is only one voice, one set of values that basically dictate whether or not you belong. Something else that academia is notorious for is tokenism. And tokenism is kind of like that battle we often get into between a symbol and authenticity. And so a symbol, sometimes the way that you might hear it is like, oh, well, look, we're no longer, racist, or we now have diversity because we have this one, Black person in our department. And it's kind of like a way to say, like, look, we are addressing systemic racism because we have this symbol, versus having an authentic investment in making sure that we create environments where Black students feel welcomed. Bias and discrimination. Now, bias and discrimination in academia shows up in a variety of ways. I'm going to say this probably several times during our presentation. Is that I believe, or the argument that I'm making, is that no policy is race neutral. So I'm going to repeat that. No policy in academia is race neutral. And the reason why we know this is once we get into the data of how we're doing by Black students enrolled in online classes, you'll have a clearer picture of what I mean by that. So bias and discrimination isn't always something formal, right? It's not a rule that says like, oh, minoritized students or Black students specifically, only get these rights, but then other students get these other rights. It's not always very explicit. And we'll talk about how bias shows up in the classroom and how that impacts the success of Black students in our institution. We know that, limited resources are also an issue in institutions of higher learning. And the reason why resources are, sometimes neglected or even not even acknowledged, right? It's not even like we actually see it as a necessity for our students, is because we see the experience of higher learning as a privilege, right? We are privileged to be here. And so the expectation is that our students already enter with certain experiences and knowledge that will kind of put them in the right place to succeed in on a college or university. But we know that that's not true, that we have to have resources in place, because that assumption is very elitist and it ignores the history of institutional racism and anti-Blackness in this country. And those aren't things that are divorced from academia, right? They're intrinsically tied together. So the idea that students can succeed without resources, without us thinking about what minoritized students might need in order to be successful, can be a bit of an elitist, perspective. We know that financial barriers block opportunity. And that's one of the special things about community colleges, right? That community colleges are supposed to be a haven for students who, want to save money. Instead of going to a four-year university and getting into debt, they come to a community college and get their prereqs and get ready to transfer. And that way their time at a four-year institution isn't that long, and it's cheaper and more affordable, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that financial barriers, are a big determining factor of whether or not students can succeed. And then there's cultural alienation. And so cultural alienation specifically talks about the way we whitewash, or the way that we center Eurocentric knowledge and points of view. As an English major, I was very fortunate to go to a school, a women's college. And at the time that I was there, we had just experienced a big wave of affirmative action acceptance. Like, we were like the most diverse group of students that was accepted the year that my freshman year, when I showed up at Mills. But one of the things that created that alienation was that the curriculum that we were experiencing was still very whitewashed. It was still very centered around Eurocentric knowledge. And then there was that one auxiliary course, right? That African American, 19th century African American literature course that was like in the back lot, right? Like hidden from the main grounds of the campus. And so when we talk about cultural alienation, we're also talking about creating a culture of belonging. And I'll talk about a survey that the district did that where students were asked about the importance of belonging. And so many of our students in our district actually shared that belonging is so important to them. So cultural alienation can impact whether a student, perceives in the class that they might be having challenges, if they perceive that they can be successful. Cultural alienation sometimes can create a feeling of loneliness, like you can't make mistakes because the standard is Eurocentric, the standard is whiteness. And so that's why it's so important for us to focus on building a culture of belonging. Now, I talked a little bit about the parallels and how tight the parallels are between the ivory tower and anti-Blackness. So, can you guys see this? I just want to make sure I don't have anything in the way. So again, you know what I mean? The way that, hegemony and the ivory tower, it's a tenet. Well, in anti-Blackness, lack of representation is also a problem because it ends up basically, there is an absence of the contributions that, Black intellectuals and critical thinkers and writers and scientists, right, bring into the discussion, into spaces of learning. And so when there is an absence of representation, right, there is an immediate feeling of alienation. Do I even belong here? One of the things that in our Black student panel that we had last semester, one of our students talked about being the only Black student in the classroom. And so as he was in a Zoom classroom, the pictures of all the students were popping up, and that he specifically felt like he could never be late. He could never make a mistake because he was going to be judged more severely, that was going to stand out to the white professor. So lack of representation can not only be a physical roadblock, but also an emotional roadblock for Black students. Bias and discrimination. Now, when we started with the first panel, we're talking about the ivory tower. I talked about how no policy is race neutral. And this is one of the reasons why talking about equity and social justice and removing equity gaps is a social justice issue. Because we understand that whether we know it or not, whether we're conscious of it or not conscious of it, there are biases in the way that we operate in this world. And so, a lot of those biases can be racial profiling, right? We have incidences where in our district where Black students have been hyper policed. They have been perceived as being up to quote unquote no good. And so the criminalization that Black people experience out in this in the world we live in, right, is also something that is mimicked in institutions of higher learning. So we are not this bubble, right? We like exist under the same in the same context, under the same constructs. It's just that we're a micro expression of a larger kind of, issue that we deal with every day. And so Black students come into our campuses already knowing what a bias looks like, already knowing what it feels to be profiled or what it feels to be held to an unreasonable standard or a different standard. So I don't, I think as instructors, it's really important for us to be mindful of that. Because whether it's our intention, our biases, can manifest in our classrooms. This is one of the reasons why, I always argue that the burden in creating trust and creating connection and belonging is on the instructor. It is our burden to do that, right? To welcome our students, to make them feel like they belong, because our students don't, they're already operating in a world where they feel like they don't belong. Another tenet of anti-Blackness is a limited access to resources. And so, I talked a little bit about closing racial equity gaps in institutions of higher learning, is a question of social justice, right? We should be motivated by principles of social justice. And one of the things that I love about West LA is that, we have been very dedicated in creating professional development opportunities for our faculty and staff around race and racism and equity. And so those resources, oftentimes teachers walk away from this like thinking like, okay, how can I implement some of the things that I've learned, some of the practices that I've learned into my classroom? And I would say that there are some things that you're like, wait a minute, how do we know that this works? Things like, having your class be zero cost, right? This is a resource that we offer to our students, something that students don't have to worry about. And how can we tell whether this is something that helps Black students? Oftentimes, the things that specifically help Black students end up helping all students, because it's a way of looking at education and the type of instruction that we provide in a very social justice orientation. And so many of our students will end up benefiting from these types of practices. And so when we consider, the limited resources that we might have at a community college, we have to be creative and really think about, well, what are some other interventions that I can implement in my classrooms to kind of circumvent, financial challenges or, issues with accessibility, right? These are all things that we can think about implementing in our classes. Obviously financial barriers. We know that, communities of color are, systemically under-resourced. So I know a lot of times, we talk about like, well, this is an under-researched community. No, we have to really acknowledge that the under-resourcing is very intentional. It's very systemic. So when our students show up to our campus, again, this is an experience that they're already familiar with. It's interesting because as an English instructor, I didn't truly like, obviously I value all of my colleagues, but I didn't really truly understand how challenging the position of a counselor can be, because all of the nuances of like being able to guide our students and make sure that they have all the resources that they need in order to start off a semester successfully. Like, I didn't realize all the levels that that it takes in order to orient a student and get them ready to succeed, right? All the gaps that have to be closed. And so when you think about that, it kind of gave me a very unique perspective, because I was like, okay, how can I contribute to closing some of those challenges and closing some of those gaps? So a very quick intervention I had, right, is, before the semester, just to give students a little bit of, positive reinforcement, I send out a message and I tell them, hey, if you were worried about books, don't worry about it. We're providing this for you, on the first day. So don't worry that you have to buy any books. And it kind of, I've had students tell me like, oh my God, I was worried because, I didn't know when I was going to get my financial aid and blah, 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 blah. It was this really small thing that I can tell made a big difference, because of the response that I was getting from my students. So think about how you can acknowledge, right, how financial barriers can present a challenge when it comes to Black students being able to succeed. Think about how you can make your course more financially accessible so that, that's not something that students have to worry about. So similar to ivory tower mentality, cultural alienation and Eurocentric curriculum, I think that because, the way that we went to school, right? So when I went to school, it was very Eurocentric. We studied all the classics, right? We studied the greatest minds in our discipline, but it was very one-sided because it wasn't mindful of the fact that, we were actually limiting ourselves and whitewashing our disciplines. And so think about that, right? Think about what your curriculum looks like. Think about, is there in, what Black history, right? What contributions can you add in a authentic way, right? Not in a symbolic way, in an authentic way to your curriculum. Because I feel like one thing that anti-Blackness does is that erasure, right? That where Black students don't see themselves reflected in their learning environments and in their learning communities. And then, last but not least, hostility, right? A hostile campus and a hostile classroom environment, right? So this can be, challenging because sometimes as instructors, we are thinking about the whole class, right? We're like, okay, I got 40 students in here. Let me figure out how I'm going to run this classroom, most effectively for all 40 students. Our grant and what this training is asking faculty to do is to actually really zero in terms of how hostility can be communicated through your policies, through, your process of how you welcome students, how you're communicating if students belong or not. I remember when I was in school, I went to, school that was very prestigious. And I remember going to classroom and I would say that the majority of the women in my classroom had their textbooks with them, were ready to hit the, the first day of class. And they were already working on chapter 1 on the first day of class. I had no idea we needed to get the book. I'm first generation college student, right? So immediately it felt like a very unwelcoming environment because there was information that I didn't know. So think about that. What are some of the assumptions that we make that students should know that might make Black students feel like they're not welcomed or they cannot be successful? So I have a very quick story of something that I did as an instructor. Again, I didn't do it with malice, but again, I was thinking about a class of 40 students. I wasn't being very, very thoughtful about it, right? So I was teaching at a different campus, and I was a class that was 2 levels below college level writing. And this was before, AB 705 and, once we started doing that work. But this was a class that was 2 levels below college level English. So the majority of my class were Spanish speakers. Like they had just passed their ESL courses and they were jumping into their first all English class, right? Where we speak all in English. And I had a little group of students, maybe like 6 or 7 students, that would come to class early to talk to me and to kind of get a sense of, well, what are we going to study today? So that they can like pay attention to what the important parts were, right? Like they wanted to like kind of zero in once the lecture part started. I was a newer teacher. I was just trying to do my best, right? In a classroom of 40 students with 40 different needs. And so as the students would come in earlier, I would be setting up my classroom, testing the technology, which never worked. Not at West, this was another campus. Testing the technology, which never worked, trying to find a marker that worked. It was just, I was dealing with it the best way I knew how. And so because I'm Spanish speaking, I was having a conversation with students in Spanish, right? Because it was easier for them to understand. Maybe like 2 weeks into it, I had a Black student approach me, I think probably towards the end of class. And he mentioned, he was like, when you give this information to the Spanish speaking students, you don't translate it, right? And so in my mind, I'm thinking, well, it's before the class even begins, right? Like, like I didn't think much of it. But in reality, I was like, no, you're right. Even in my attempt to help students, you know what I mean? I wasn't being mindful of how me speaking a language that Black students may not speak or understand, right? How they might feel like they've been excluded. So immediately I had to like, I was like, okay, I want to continue translating things for these students that are getting here early. So what I can do now is have the conversation with them in Spanish and then basically have the same conversation with the class in English, like, oh, Mary and I were talking about this, and she brought up a good point. So making sure that students were felt included in the conversation, and that there weren't any like secrets or anything like that where students might feel like I don't know what's going on, and if I don't know if I'm missing out on something, on information that might be important, or even better, that might be helpful. Because I'm sure there were things that I told the students, that something that was helpful that other students could have benefited from, right? So that was a lesson learned for me, right? Of how unintentionally I created a hostile classroom. I created a classroom where students felt excluded. I think a good sign of that was just how the student felt comfortable, holding me accountable to it, and we had a really good conversation about it. The student ended up sharing a very traumatic experience he had with another English teacher. And so we were able to kind of bond on that, and I was able to give him some resources and how to handle that situation, through, the student advocacy process. And so, I always invite, students to, there's like an understanding that we're all here to learn, and sometimes the teacher is the student and the student is the teacher. So, I feel like that was something very positive that happened out of that situation. It was a great learning experience. And I think it also made me a better teacher, like an opportunity to like think about my practice critically. So what I'm showing you here, and Artur is here with us. So if Artur wants to pitch in any thoughts in the chat, feel free, Artur. But what I'm showing you right now is our equity dashboard here at West LA. And it basically talks about, or it shows us what our institutional set standard is and how our students are doing when it comes to a course success rate. And so this is specifically broken down to ethnicity. But the real great thing about our dashboard is that you can break up the data into like age, ethnicity, gender. You can tweak it to whatever your needs are, right? Whatever you want to learn is happening, in your classroom. And this is a tool that you can use by section as well. And I'll make a pitch about that soon. So, in fall of 2023, Tiffany and I were hired to lead the CRPP grant, and the CRPP grant specifically is designed to close racial equity gaps with Black students in online courses. And so immediately we wanted to study, right? What are our success numbers? How are we doing with Black students at West LA? So I'm including just kind of a quick snapshot of what's happening in our campus. So if you look at, the third line, we can see that for several years now, we have failed to meet the institutional set standards, specifically with Black students. And so what this grant is designed to do is to mobilize faculty, right, to become data-driven, meaning to pull the data from their online courses, take a look at to see how they're doing with Black students, and then adopt a classroom instructional intervention. And once that's adopted for a semester, check their data again to see if there was any improvement in closing the equity gap with Black students in their online courses. And so all of this work is data-driven because data can tell us a story. And, as a faculty, data in the beginning used to make me a little nervous because I'm like, well, data won't capture this or won't capture this. Sometimes data can't capture the nuances or the circumstance of how we ended up with, such poor numbers. But at the end of the day, there was always something to learn, something of value to learn. And it ended up helping me be more strategic and intentional in my teaching practices. And I noticed that once I started pulling my data, immediately at the forefront of my mind, I was like, okay, this is obviously not working. What can I do different? And being more intentional with the way I communicated with students in terms of my practice. And yeah, so I just kind of want to check in to see, if there are any questions, anything that I can answer as before I move on.
No, I think you're doing a great job.
Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know if you
Hmm?
No
We
question.
do have a question. Go ahead.
You mentioned the third line. If you go back to that last slide, you talking about the 1,000, I'm on the right slide, the 1,000 point difference for what are you referring to? I'm looking at the black where it says 1,116 additional passing students needed to close equity gap.
Yeah, so one of the great things that our database does is that it'll specifically tell you, right, what percentage of students, specifically how many students we would need in order to close that racial equity gap. And so this also does it not only by discipline, and it also does it by course. So when you pull your course data, you will get to see how many Black students need to pass your class in order to close the equity gap. So for example, if I'm teaching an English 101 class and I pull my data for my English 101 class, it'll tell me specifically, you need these many students to pass your class in order for you to close the racial equity gap with Black students in your course.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Okay. So how does this show up on a daily basis, right? How does anti-Blackness show up on a daily basis? And again, this can happen in office hours. This can happen in our classrooms. This can happen as we're walking out of the classroom. This can happen as a student is seeking a resource or assistance from financial aid, from their counselor as they're walking through the campus, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about microaggressions. And it's interesting because when we talk about microaggressions, right, and we talk about specifically racism and anti-Blackness, sometimes, we might perceive it as something that is obvious, right? Something very explicit that someone said. But in reality, what students usually experience is this idea of death by 1,000 paper cuts. The idea of death by 1,000 paper cuts basically means that the racial slights that a student might experience throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the class, throughout the semester amounts, right, to a feeling of death, right? To a feeling like, damn, like, what am I doing here? Right? Can I actually be successful in this classroom? Is this the college that I actually want to be in? Am I even welcomed here? Do I belong here? Right? So it is the culmination of multiple experiences where Black students might feel, right, that they don't belong in our classrooms, that they don't belong in our campus. And the reason why it's so important for us to acknowledge that is because it forces us to be more self-aware. And when any time a microaggression is committed, it also forces us to be more introspective, right? Of what are some of our biases and how are we communicating those biases to our students? So the idea of death by 1,000 paper cuts, it's a description that was authored by Daryl Sue. If you ever get a chance, you can Google NPR Daryl Sue. Microaggressions. He does an amazing interview where he explains microaggressions. He gives you like a dozen examples of how this shows up in different environments and different social settings. If you ever are interested in reading about it, there's a book by Claudia Rankin. It's specifically poetry and vignettes, and she talks about microaggressions in the book as well. So there are a lot of resources out there that'll give you a very clear picture of how this shows up, how this can show up in the daily lives of Black students. As a consequence to microaggressions, Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson did research around this idea of stereotype threat. I mentioned earlier how there was a student in our Black student panel last semester where he talked about how being the only Black student in the panel or in his classroom, kind of felt like he couldn't make any mistakes, like he had to be there on time. Like it was like an additional weight and additional stress or stressors because he was the only Black student there. And he mentioned that, what would making a mistake say about Black students. And so that there was no room, right? And we all know that learning and the human experience, right? Part of our human experience in this world is about making mistakes and us learning from our mistakes. So you can only imagine the weight that our students feel whenever they're in an academic environment, whenever they're in our classrooms, and they might feel like they don't want to prove a stereotype right. They don't want to prove a stereotype true. So, whenever you get a chance, you can go onto YouTube, type in Claude Steele, Joshua Aronson. Their research is very, very interesting. So many people have done work around this. But it's important for us to acknowledge that there is, for Black students, there's this additional weight and unreasonable responsibility that they're already placing on themselves, right? Because the ivory tower, right? The tenets of academia and how academia functions and anti-Blackness are directly connected, right? It's like the same thing when we were looking at that chart. So what do we do about it? So the CRPP grant, I want to tell you a little bit about it, and I want to encourage you all to join if you are passionate about ensuring that we're doing everything we can to closing racial equity gaps with Black students in online classes. This is an amazing opportunity. So I consider the work that we're doing as we are agents of change. And agents of change specifically are individuals or groups, right, that are instigating transformation in the institution by asking the right questions, by making sure that, we are addressing challenges, that we're not just sugarcoating or whitewashing the problem, right? That we're being critical about how we're going to enact systemic change. And we already have a batch of, agents of social change. So for the cohort of fall 2023 and spring 2024, we have 10 faculty coaches. These 10 faculty coaches they volunteered and they have been assigned a division where they are responsible for communicating with the division chair and talking to the colleagues in that division about joining this effort. The effort is asking us to request our course data, our online course data, and disaggregate it by race and study what are our outcomes, what are our racial equity gaps with Black students in our online classes. The second step, once that data is requested, is what intervention are you going to implement in order to close those gaps? So this cohort, we have 10 faculty coaches, we have 17 faculty participants, and we have received 28 requests for data, and 23 faculty have actually requested their data. So that might be like a faculty person requested 2 different sections, right? Or, an English 101 and English 103. So we have faculty already instigating the work by requesting their data. You're instigating the status quo because you're doing that self-reflection work that is critical in really dismantling anti-Blackness. So very briefly, these are our agents of social change. These are the divisions that each faculty coach is overseeing or responsible for. And so take a look if you're interested in joining this wave and becoming an agent of social change. These are your contact people. Obviously, Tiffany and I are also here. Your data person, the person that you would request your data from, is Ortiz. And so there are several people here to help guide the work. And we're working on recruiting our next cohort. So our fall 2024, spring 2025 cohort. And we want to, invite as many of you and inspire as many of you. Bring a friend, even if it was somebody that didn't come to this webinar, bring somebody with you. We want to make sure that we create a movement around this. Are there any questions that I can answer as my presentation does its thing, or any comments you want to share?
The chat is correct.
Yeah.
Okay. Lots of stuff going on in the chat. Discussions from other professors about actually experiencing stereotype threat themselves, so they could imagine students in an environment where there's a clear power differential, really feeling it. And so a couple people chimed in on that. People, graciously putting the different resources in for Claude Steele and for the other person's work. And yeah, people like just grooving with you. But I think Elena had something she wanted to add. So go ahead, Elena.
Yeah, I'm thinking back of the data. And how does it come? I mean, I know demographically each campus is different population wise, but when you break it down by, race, ethnicity, how does it compare? Are the numbers this like similar as far as equity gap?
So,
I'm just thinking
so-
like comparisons.
so I mean, our tour is here, so maybe he can answer that question.
Yeah, maybe
but-
that's a larger question because I think with these initiatives, it'll be interesting to compare.
Yeah. So I can tell you, because before
Anecdotally.
coming to West, I was a faculty and chair at LA Trade Tech. And when I was there, our largest racial equity gap was Black men. That was our largest racial equity gap.
Yeah.
So, I don't know what that data looks now. Tiffany and I have been working specifically here at West because this is where we have our most power, right, to enact change. So it would be an interesting question. Maybe our tour can kind of plop that into the chat. We have like, I just want to kind of make sure that we cover everything that's most important, and then I'll leave room for some more discussion. So Tiffany brought up an excellent point. Thank you, Queen, which was this discussion around power. And one thing that, I learned in doing this work was how much power I have as a tenured faculty member. As a tenured faculty member, I just emailed Pat and I said, hey, Tiffany and I want to do a presentation. Wow, Tiffany and I have a seat at the table. Even if we don't get to vote, we can actually, talk and people will listen. We have so much power on our campus, and sometimes we don't really value how much that is. We get to speak up at our division meetings or at our discipline meetings. We get to go to discipline day and speak up there. We can go talk to the union and speak to the union there. We get to talk to each other. And so power on our campus might look like this. So this is a triangle of power. It's specifically from a book that was authored by one of my mentors, Dr. Estella Ben-Simon. And her and her colleagues basically said, when you are data driven, when you are focused on closing the racial equity goals for your class or for your institution, there are many tables that you're going to have to sit at and talk about why this is important. Why is it important for us to close racial equity gaps with Black students in online classes? You get to do it at academic senate. You get to do it at your department meetings. You get to do it with the faculty you like having lunch with off campus, right? These are conversations that do not operate just in isolation in one moment, space, and time. That as an agent of change, if this is important that you want to invest yourself in, and we should, right? Bring up those conversations, in every space you have a voice. It's really important that we put this at the forefront. So one of my favorite scholars that, really guides my work is, Professor Bell Hooks. She passed away not too long ago. And I really use a lot of her theoretical work to remind me, right, to continue to be self-aware, to continue to educate myself on how best to serve Black students, and to really, I say that I'm about it, right? I got to be about it. So these are some of the questions that can come up for you as you have a seat at the table, right? As you're talking to your colleagues. Number one question, the data analysis. What are our institution's equity gaps? What are my equity gaps in my classroom? Pull your own receipts. Take a look at how you're doing, because you have an opportunity to do better. Think about your own biases. What is the internal and individual work that we're doing? And one of the ways that I decided to do that was by pulling out my teaching philosophy, like that dusty teaching philosophy I hadn't seen in forever, right? And looking at to see, well, where do I talk about, closing racial equity gaps specifically for Black students? How am I communicating what my practice is about? I say that this is important. How am I communicating this in my philosophy? How are we communicating belonging in a authentic way? Specifically, when our colleagues raise their hand and they want to talk about Black students, are we listening? Are we joining? Are we supporting? How are we welcoming Black students into our classrooms, into our institutions? Is it in an authentic way, or is it in a symbolic way? How are you defining authenticity? Right? Very important. Also, how are we using our seats at the table to advocate for Black students? And I would say, most importantly, where is the student voice? How do we know we are successful? How do we know students, specifically Black students, are connecting to our practices and that they're translating to their success? So another resource, if it can be sent out in the chat, this is some of the kind of self-reflecting work that I want to encourage everybody here to partake in. It's very lengthy, and it's asking some very poignant question, and it's going to require you to do some self-reflection. So I wanted to give you, a handout, to help you do some of that work. And part of this work is really about making sure that we're equity-minded practitioners. And equity-minded practitioners really focus on doing the work to closing racial equity gaps with our students. We have a problem here at our campus with Black students. So we want to ask some of these questions on how we're going to do that. What is the step-by-step process that we're going to follow in our individual work? And how are we going to reflect that individual work when we go out onto our campuses, out onto our committees, as we're talking to our colleagues about why this work is important? So I'm going to go ahead and have either Leslie or Tiffany send that handout through the chat, because it is very lengthy and extensive.
Already done.
Excellent. The second thing I want to ask you to do is pull out your cell phones, scan the QR code. If you are interested in doing the self-evaluation, we have included an easy way to request your data, your course data. When you click on the code, it'll take you to the page where you enter the class you want to request it for, the section number, and that data will be sent only to you. It is sent directly to the faculty that requested it. Nobody else gets to see it. So take a minute, pull out your phones, scan the QR code, request your data. It's the first step into doing this work, and it's important work, the data aspect of it. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to do that. Tiffany, anything we need to address so far? I see like 35 comments in the chat.
No, we got it all under control. We're having good convos over here. People agreeing. Grace Chi says that they love the topic of belonging, which is often challenged as an immigrant. Dr. Battle put in a resource in there. Artur put in a resource for more equity information from a district perspective. So if you're interested in that, check that out. All good stuff.
Okay, cool.
And
All right.
Olga did have a question. I don't know if you saw her hand. So yeah.
I didn't. Go ahead, Olga.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the work that you guys are doing, much necessary. What I would like to see, and maybe you already have it, but I like to see that we develop this kind of focus center where we can go and continue this journey of learning in a one spot sort of center of information. And so, because there's so much going on and all of us are doing a million things, that we cannot possibly type or retain everything that we're learning, but it's so wonderful to be able to go back and focus on certain things. For instance, our division is doing, the social sciences division is doing right now a program review, a comprehensive program review that includes the examination of all this data. And so this will be a very important thing for us to also speak even with better, more precise language when we write that report, right? Because it's our self-assessment. So yeah, maybe you guys already have that, but if you don't, I will absolutely love to have an equity educational center, call it the way you want it, but all that information for all of us to access anytime. Thank you.
So this is our first year, doing the grant, and one of the things that Tiffany and I have on our to-do list is creating a web page where we're going to upload, we call this a toolkit. Since we've done several of these CRPP webinars already, including the Black Student Panel. So we'll have a center, we'll have somewhere where we can locate not just this information, but also our agents of change, right? The folks that are actually moving the work throughout our campus. So I just wanted to provide a very brief summary about, if you were to take 3 points away from this presentation, right, is this idea of educating as the practice of freedom. Educating as a practice of freedom is a very Bell Hooksian idea, right? And what are those 3 steps? In a very short, summarized way. Number 1, the data analysis and the self-reflection, right? The data tells us one story. The other part that comes in with the data analysis is the part where we work on our self-reflection, not just of our practice, but where are our blind spots, right? Where are the areas that we need to work on that are being somehow communicated into our classrooms? Number 2, how are we communicating belonging? How are we being intentional of how we're communicating belonging? And not just intentional, communicating it in a authentic way. That's what's important, doing it authentically. And then finally, how are we advocating for Black students? And this also includes not just empowering faculty members, but empowering Black students too, right? Making sure that they are the center of how we are implementing our strategies, how we're talking about, the types of innovations and the types of practices that we can incorporate into our institution, but also into our classroom. The final thing I wanted to say, and I'll try to cover this unfortunately in 2 minutes so that I can take the last couple of questions, is this idea of Black joy. I see that a lot of faculty, and I'm specifically talking about non-Black faculty. I see that a lot of non-Black faculty sometimes in their attempt to incorporate diversity and to incorporate, the Black experience, sometimes, we can find ourselves trauma dumping. And what I want to say is that the most subversive way that we can incorporate, celebration of Black students and celebration of the accomplishments of Black people is by thinking about it as Black joy. So there isn't one central place that defines Black joy. This is like a collection of social justice agents, educators, researchers. And so this is just like a 10-point comprehension list. It's not like the list exists in one place, but these are all little pieces that you can consider that might give you some leads or ideas on how you can incorporate Black joy and how you can communicate belonging for Black students. And this includes designing artifacts, redoing your syllabus, looking at your policies. Because remember, I'm going to say it for the 4th time. No policy is race neutral, right? So looking at your own policies, looking at your grading, looking at your attendance, right? Looking at how you're communicating your assignments. Are they clear? So think about how you can how you can incorporate Black joy in all of your different practices and all of your interventions, because what we don't want to do is add to the trauma, right? Or add to, or trauma dump on students, that we really should just be communicating that they belong and that we believe they can be successful. I went ahead and made this a handout. Tiffany is going to go ahead and send it to you on the chat. And then, we have 4 minutes for questions. I think it's Katie.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was just curious, part of, your data collection, did you see, were you able to compare Hispanic students' experiences to see if they were similar or different at West, or?
So the data collection that I pulled, that I showed on during the webinar, included all races, but this specific grant, the CRPP grant, is focused on Black students in online courses. So the work that we're doing, that Tiffany and I are doing, and that our
Yeah.
agents of change and our participants are doing, is specific to Black students in online classes, but the data for all other groups is also available. If you know,
Okay, I was just curious. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, thank
it's
you.
available. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments that I can answer? There's like 56 comments in the chat. Wow. Tiffany, Leslie, anything that I need to address?
No, I think this was so thorough, so comprehensive. You hit on so many different points. And I think that you really made a really good, call for faculty to actually get involved. If you want to just get involved on the individual level, right, to look at your own data, start there. But we would love to pull some of y'all into the actual work that we're doing. We have the next cohort starting in the fall. I put our emails in the chat, and I can do that again if anybody is interested in participating. And I'll open the floor up for folks to just give some feedback, what you think, how'd it go. There's lots of clapping hands on the on all the boxes. But if there's anybody that wants to give any feedback, any thoughts?
Well, I'm gonna add one more thing, if I may. I'm gonna say that the thought that what this is that we are addressing right now, the effort, the grant, the people involved in it, the desire to change, is going to be a model, I hope, for all the other students. And that also answers the question of the previous speaker, right? Because I am following this because this is going to be beneficial not only for Black students, but for all our students, because we will use this as a model as we move along. So, thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you for this information. Is Ronnie Felder on this Zoom? He was the contact associated with my department. No? Okay, I'll look for him on the email.
And I just put my email in the chat. So if you want to, you can email me and then I can link y'all.
And Jeremy has his hand up.
Yeah, let's see, do that, and then we'll do that. So Siwa, it's not his face. One thing I want to say is that I am sort of, what's the word, encouraged by this. I know in math, one of the issues that we have in math is like there's such a dearth, of sort of this type of thing in math. Like, we get a lot of people just saying there's a lot of, with other disciplines, there's a lot of crossover. And I'll say because of this grant, I have had to dig really deep to find things that possibly could work. And so I've found some things that work, and I've been encouraged by this. And I think this semester I have definitely put a lot of effort, and I just want to, be appreciative of just the encouragement that the two of you have given me. And also, I should not be remiss of Mr. Coffee, Professor Coffee, although he should have been a Dr. Coffee in mathematics, but that's okay. It's okay. And the conversations I've had with him, and I know we will have more conversations. And I think it's so, but anyways, I'm cautiously optimistic about this.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, I'm here if you have any questions or if there's any follow-up that maybe a question you want to ask offline. I'll stick around for a couple more minutes. I want to thank everybody for showing up. It's a Wednesday, 6:30 to 7:30. We wanted to make sure that we made it available to as many people as possible. And we still missed out on a few because there's some instructors that are teaching this evening. But thank you so much for coming. And, again, I invite you to join the wave. I invite you to join the agents of change. Our students deserve it. Black students deserve it. And it's in our hands to make sure that we close those racial equity gaps with Black students in online classes. So thank you so much for joining us and participating in this important discussion.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Tiffany. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for participating, showing up. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye. Oh, we could stop recording, huh?
Okay, yeah.